Maybe that'll teach him some respect. My sister-in-law laughed as my father-in-law threw red wine in my face. They thought I'd stay silent until I made one phone call. The wine was still dripping down my face when I heard her laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind of laugh someone makes when they don't know what else to do. I mean a full, delighted, ugly laugh. The kind that comes from a place deep inside a person where they've been storing contempt for a long, long time. Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach him some respect. Filthy pig. That was my wife's sister, Bridget, and the man sitting across the table from me, lowering the crystal wine glass back down like he just made a perfectly reasonable point during a board meeting. That was Harlan Voss, my father-in-law, a man who had never once, not in 4 years of marriage to his daughter, looked at me like I was anything more than a problem he'd failed to solve. My wife, Eloise, sat completely still beside me. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't say his name. She didn't stand up. She just looked down at her plate like the moment might pass if she waited long enough. There were 11 other people at that table. New Year's Eve dinner at the Voss family estate in Highland Park, Dallas. White tablecloths, catered food, a house that costs more than most people earn in 20 years. And me, Conrad Ellison, sitting there with a $600 shirt soaked in Chateau Margaux, while my wife's family decided whether or not to laugh along. Most of them did. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I am not a man who loses his temper in public. I'm a corporate attorney. I've sat across from people at negotiating tables who were actively trying to destroy companies I'd spent years building relationships with. And I have never once raised my voice. I know what it means to be calm when every cell in your body is screaming. I know exactly what it costs, and I know exactly what it's worth. So when I tell you that I felt my hands grip that chair with everything I had, I need you to understand that wasn't me losing control. That was me deciding very deliberately what control was actually going to look like that night. I stood up. I looked at Harlan Voss, and then I walked to the hallway, pulled out my phone, and made one call. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were humiliating a man who had everything to lose. What they didn't know was that the phone call I was about to make would begin unraveling a web of arrangements Harlan Voss had spent 15 years carefully building. Arrangements that depended entirely on one thing staying quiet. Me. Before you hear what happened at that table and what happened after, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you're new here. Hit that like button. Drop a comment below. I read every single one because the people who share these stories and the people who listen to them are part of the same thing. A reminder that dignity is not something anyone can take from you. They can try. Lord knows some people will spend their entire lives trying, but it doesn't work that way. Now, let me tell you about Harlan Voss. My name is Conrad Ellison. I'm 46 years old. I was born in Fort Worth, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, and never once complained about it. Not to me. Not to anyone. She was the kind of woman who packed a lunch and a list of goals every single morning, and treated both with equal seriousness. I put myself through undergrad at UT Austin, went to law school at SMU Dedmond in Dallas, and spent the next 2 decades building a practice in corporate and family business law that, I'll say modestly, became one of the more respected boutique firms in North Texas. My clients are privately held family businesses, most of them multi-generational, most of them navigating the exact kind of internal politics and succession drama that makes good people do ugly things to each other. I've seen everything. I thought I had. I met Eloise Voss at a charity gala in the Ritz-Carlton in uptown Dallas 7 years ago. She was wearing a dark green dress and arguing quietly but fiercely with a waiter about whether the event should have hired more local caterers. She had opinions. She stated them clearly, and she apologized to nobody for either. I introduced myself. We talked for 3 hours. I was done for. What I didn't fully understand then, and what I should have asked more questions about, was the world she came from. The Voss family is old Dallas money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself. but has its name quietly attached to buildings, foundations, and endowments across the city. Harlan Voss built the family's commercial real estate portfolio into something significant over 3 decades. He's the type of man who knows exactly how much everything costs and exactly what leverage every relationship gives him. He sits on 3 non-profit boards, goes to the right church, plays golf with the right people, and has never once in his life been told no by someone he considered beneath him. I was from the first day Eloise brought me home a problem. Not because I was unsuccessful. My practice was doing well even then. Not because I was disrespectful or difficult. I have always been nothing but courteous to that man. The problem was simpler and uglier than any of that. The problem was that I didn't come from his world, didn't owe anything to his world, and didn't need anything from his world. And for a man whose entire operating system runs on leverage, a son-in-law he can't leverage is a son-in-law who terrifies him. He covered it with politeness at first, the performative kind, firm handshakes, polite interest in my career, the occasional well-placed comment about how impressive it was that I'd built something from nothing, delivered in exactly the tone you'd use to compliment a stray dog for learning to sit. Eloise didn't hear it. She was too close to it, had grown up breathing that particular air. But I heard it every time. Then came Bridget. Eloise's younger sister is 38 years old and has never held a job for more than 14 months. She has a degree she rarely mentions, an ex-husband nobody in the family talks about, and a talent for managing the social politics of the Voss family inner circle that is genuinely impressive in its own terrible way. Bridget knew who sat where in that family long before I arrived, and she made it her project to make sure I understood my position. The comments were always small, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. A reference to a neighborhood I'd grown up in, delivered with a small smile. A question about where my mother was these days, asked sweetly, knowing my mother had passed away 3 years earlier. A story at a family dinner about someone who'd come up the hard way that somehow always looped back to the importance of knowing where you came from. Harlan never corrected her. He'd just smile and change the subject, which was its own kind of permission. Eloise hated it. She told me she hated it. We had versions of the same argument about it probably 30 times across 4 years of marriage. She'd confront her father. Things would smooth over for a few weeks and then it would start again, a little worse each time. The boundary pushed a little further, the reset lasting a little less long. And I kept thinking, because I am at my core an optimist about people, that there was a version of this that could be resolved, that the Voss family wasn't irredeemable, that time and patience and the slow accumulation of proof that I was worthy of their daughter might eventually land somewhere good. I was wrong. And New Year's Eve in Highland Park is where I finally understood exactly how wrong I was. The dinner started the way those dinners always started, with a studied performance of normally. The Voss family estate on Beverly Drive is a 1920s Tudor revival that Harlan and his wife Sandra had renovated twice and maintained with the kind of precision that tells you a house is more stage set than home. The dining room seats 16 comfortably. That night, there were 13 of us. Harlan and Sandra, Eloise and me, Bridget and her current boyfriend, whose name I kept forgetting because he rarely said anything, Eloise's brother Garrett and his wife Naomi, 2 sets of family friends, the Holloways and the Parishes, and Harlan's mother, a 91-year-old woman named Dolores, who said very little, but watched everything. The food was catered by a restaurant in Preston Hollow that charges a private event fee that would make most people choke. The wine was Harlan's doing. He took great pride in his cellar, liked to announce the vintage before anyone took a sip, liked the ritual of control that came with choosing what everyone drank. I had been careful going into that dinner. Eloise and I had talked about it on the drive over, she in the passenger seat reminding me that her father had been under stress with a commercial deal in Fort Worth that had gotten complicated, asking me to be patient, asking me to let things go. I told her I always let things go. She gave me a look that suggested she knew exactly what that sentence cost me and loved me for paying it anyway. The first hour was fine. The food was excellent. Garrett and I had a genuinely good conversation about a construction contract dispute he was navigating. He respected the law, liked talking it through with me. Sandra was warm in her distant way. Even Bridget was behaving, which should have been a sign that something was coming because Bridget's politeness is never a resting state. It's always preparation. The conversation turned, as it always eventually did at Voss family dinners, to business. Harlan's deal in Fort Worth, a new mixed-use development he was partnering on near West 7th Street. He was talking about the financing structure, the partnership arrangement, the timeline. I was listening, and then he said something technically wrong. I want to be precise about this because it matters to what happened next. He described a contractual arrangement between two of his LLCs as if a certain provision was legally airtight, when I knew professionally and specifically that the provision he was describing had been challenged in Texas courts and found unenforceable in 2 separate cases in the last 18 months. It was the kind of mistake that could cost him and his partners hundreds of thousands of dollars if the deal ever went sideways. So I said quietly and without any drama that he might want to have someone take another look at that particular clause, that there had been some recent case law in Texas that complicated it. Harlan looked at me. The table went quiet in that particular way that tells you everyone already knows the temperature of what's about to happen. "Conrad," he said, setting down his fork, "I've been structuring deals in this city since before you had a law license. I think I understand my own contracts." "Of course," I said. "I'm just mentioning it as something that might be worth a second look. The Meridian Partners case out of Harris County last spring specifically addressed that type of provision. I didn't ask for legal advice." "No," I said. "You didn't. I apologize." I picked up my glass. "I thought it was over. It wasn't over. You know," Harlan said, and his voice had changed in a way that I recognized. The way a storm changes the quality of air before it arrives. Eloise's grandfather had a saying. He said you could always tell a man's character by whether he knew when to speak and when to keep his mouth shut. It was one of the most important things he ever taught me. The table was very quiet now. "Dad," Eloise said, and her voice was careful and low. "I'm just making a point," Harlan said pleasantly. "It's a good point," Bridget said, and she smiled at me across the table. The kind of smile that has teeth in it. I looked at Harren. I did not look away. I said nothing. I had been a lawyer for 20 years. I knew the value of silence. And that's when he picked up his wineglass, leaned forward, and threw it in my face. Not a splash, not a fumble. He picked it up, looked at me, and threw it. The wine hit my face and my shirt, and ran down my collar. It was cold. The room went absolutely still. And then Bridget laughed, that full, delighted, ugly laugh, and said the words that I am never going to forget for as long as I live. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach him some respect. Filthy pig." "Dolores." Harlan's 91-year-old mother set down her fork very slowly and looked at her son with an expression I didn't have a name for at the time. I do now. It was shame. She was ashamed of her son. My wife didn't move. I sat there for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the wine drip, feeling the weight of 11 people at that table deciding who they were. And then I stood up, set my napkin on the table, excused myself quietly, and walked to the hallway. The hallway of the Voss estate is long and floored in original oak that cask in 2 specific spots near the coat closet. I knew this because I'd walked it probably 40 times over 4 years. I stood near the window that looks out over the side garden, and I dialed. The man I called is named Preston Ware. He's a partner at a firm in downtown Dallas that handles, among other things, commercial real estate litigation. Preston and I have known each other for 16 years. We've referred clients to each other, consulted on cases that touched both our areas, and more relevantly, Preston had come to me 8 months earlier about a situation that involved a contract dispute with a certain Highland Park commercial developer whose LLC structure had some very interesting characteristics. I had at the time declined to take the case due to a conflict. but I'd reviewed enough of the documents to know what was in them. "Preston," I said when he answered. It was 10:45 on New Year's Eve. He picked up anyway. "I need you to tell me something. Is the Voss situation still unresolved?" There was a pause. "Conrad, why are you calling me about this on New Year's Eve?" "Because I just had Chateau Margaux thrown in my face by Harlan Voss in front of 13 people, and I want to know if what I think I know about his partnership structure is something that his current partners are aware of." Another pause. Longer. "You're serious?" "I am completely serious. Are you still conflicted out?" I thought about Eloise sitting at that table with her eyes on her plate. "No," I said. "I don't believe I am." Preston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Call me tomorrow morning. 9:00. I've got some documents you're going to find very interesting." I stood at that window for another minute, looking out at the garden that Harlan Voss paid a landscape company $3,000 a month to maintain. And I made a decision. Not a hot decision, not a revenge fantasy, a cold, clear, professional decision about exactly how I was going to handle what came next. Then I went back to the dining room. The table had not recovered. Bridget was refilling her wine. Harren was talking to the hallways about something, performing normally. Sandra was looking at the tablecloth. Garrett was looking at me. I sat back down next to Eloise. She whispered, "Conrad, I'm so sorry." I put my hand over hers briefly. "I know," I said. "We'll talk at home." I finished dinner. I made appropriate conversation. I shook hands and said Happy New Year to the hallways and the parishes. I thanked Sandra for a lovely evening because she had nothing to do with what her husband did, and she looked like she was going to cry. I did not say anything to Harren. I did not say anything to Bridget. When we got to our car, a 12-minute drive back to our home in Lakewood, Eloise cried the entire way. Not quietly, but fully. The kind of crying that has been waiting a long time to happen. I drove, and I let her cry, and I didn't say anything until we were parked in our own driveway. Then I said, "I need you to understand something. Eloise, I've been patient with your family for 4 years. I've absorbed things I shouldn't have absorbed. I've let things go that I shouldn't have let go, and I've done it because I love you, and because I genuinely believed the situation could improve. Tonight changed that, not because wine was thrown at me, because of what it means that it was thrown at me and what it means that nobody at that table stopped it." She said I should have said something. Yes, I said you should have. We sat there in the driveway for a long time. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "My job." I said, "Let me tell you what I found out when I called Preston Ware at 9:00 the next morning on New Year's Day. Harlan Voss had over the previous 6 years structured a series of commercial real estate partnerships in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, using a network of LLCs that on the surface looked like standard development vehicles. His outside partners, the people who put money into these entities alongside him, were a rotating group of investors, some of them old money like himself, some of them newer to the market, all of them trusting the Voss name and reputation. What they didn't know, what Preston's client had discovered through the course of a contract dispute that turned into a much wider audit, was that the management fee structure Harlan had built into these partnerships was not what the operating agreement stated. There were provisions buried in amendment schedules and side letters that redirected a portion of the management fees into a separate entity that Harlan controlled solely. His partners were essentially subsidizing his personal overhead, and they had been doing so for years without knowing it. This is not a small thing. In Texas, this kind of arrangement can constitute breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on the specifics, it can rise to something considerably more serious. Preston's client had been trying to get discovery on the full scope of the arrangement. It had been slow going because Harlan had good lawyers, and because the documents were structured to make the flow of money difficult to trace. But Preston had enough to know the shape of it, and I, having reviewed several of those LLC operating agreements 8 months earlier, when Preston first brought me the matter, knew enough to fill in some of the gaps. I agreed to come on as co-counsel. Here's what happened over the next 6 weeks. And I'll tell you this part quickly because the legal mechanics are less important than what they meant. Preston and I, working together, were able to connect the documents his client had with 2 other former Voss partners who had noticed discrepancies in their distributions and never quite understood why. Those 2 partners, once they understood what they were looking at, retained their own counsel and joined the action. By the end of January, Harlan Voss was facing a civil lawsuit from 4 former and current business partners, a formal complaint to the Texas Real Estate Commission, and the beginning of what would eventually become a securities fraud investigation, because some of the investment vehicles had been structured in a way that triggered federal oversight. The Fort Worth deal he'd been talking about at the New Year's dinner, the one I'd tried to quietly warn him about, collapsed entirely when his lead financing partner pulled out upon learning about the litigation. That deal alone represented an 18-month development timeline and multiple millions in projected returns. His attorney called me in the second week of February. He wanted to discuss whether a resolution could be reached that kept certain matters out of the public record. I told him I was not in a position to make that decision on behalf of my clients, which was true. I also told him that the decision about whether to pursue a confidential resolution or a public one was entirely up to the people who had been harmed, and that those people had at the moment no particular reason to be generous about keeping things quiet. That was also true. I need to tell you about Eloise because this story isn't only about Harren. The weeks after New Year's Eve were the hardest of our marriage. Not because of the wine, not because of Bridget's laugh, not because of what I was doing professionally, because of the silence at that dinner table. Because Eloise and I both knew what it meant, and neither of us wanted to say it out loud first. She loved her father, whatever he was and whatever he'd done. She had grown up in that house, eaten at that table, carried that name. The idea that the man she'd watched build something real had been quietly cheating the people around him for years. That was something she had to process in a way I couldn't do for her. We had a lot of conversations that February that I'll never share with anyone because they belong to the 2 of us. What I'll tell you is that Eloise is braver than she gives herself credit for and stronger than her family ever understood. And that the moment she stopped trying to protect a version of her father that didn't exist, that was the moment I watched her become more herself than I had ever seen her be. She called Harren in the middle of February. I was in the other room. I didn't listen. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her shoulders were straight. She said, "He asked if I knew what you were doing. He asked me to make you stop." "What did you tell him?" I told him. She said that the only person who could have stopped this was him 4 years ago when he first decided that the man I married wasn't worth basic human decency. She paused. And then I told him that what he'd done to his partners was between him and God and the Texas court system, but that what he'd done to me was between him and me, and that it was going to take a very long time before I was willing to have that conversation. I said, "Are you okay?" She said. "Ask me again in a year." Bridget called me once in late January. I don't know what she expected. Gloating, maybe. Or possibly she wanted to gauge how bad the situation was. She said, "I hope you understand that whatever you're doing, it's going to destroy this family." I said, "Bridget, the actions that are destroying this family happened long before New Year's Eve. I'm just one of several attorneys involved in a civil matter that your father's former business partners initiated. I don't control what happens next. I only control my own professional obligations." She said, "You've always thought you were better than us." And I said, "No. I've always thought I deserved to be treated like a human being at a dinner table. Those 2 things are not the same." She hung up. The civil case settled in March. I can't discuss the specific terms because there's a confidentiality agreement, and I have professional obligations regardless of how I feel personally. What I can tell you is that Harlan Voss's involvement in active real estate partnerships in the Dallas-Fort Worth area has changed dramatically. That the Voss Family Foundation, which Sandra had chaired for 12 years and taken genuine pride in, had to restructure its funding sources and scale back several programs, that the Highland Park estate is currently listed for sale. Dolores, Harlan's 91-year-old mother, sent me a letter in February, a handwritten letter on her own stationery mailed to my office on Commerce Street in downtown Dallas. She wrote 4 sentences. She said she had watched her son become a man she didn't recognize over the past decade. She said she was sorry for what had happened at her grandson's table. She said that she had known my mother's people. She mentioned a name, a church connection from Fort Worth, something I had no idea about, and that she believed I was a man of character. She signed it with her full name. I kept that letter. It's in my desk at the office in the drawer I don't open every day. Here's what I want to tell you, and it's the thing I always try to tell people who come to me with situations that feel impossible. Situations where the power seems entirely on the other side of the table. The wine Harlan Voss threw at my face was the worst mistake he ever made. Not because it humiliated me, though it did, in front of people whose opinions I didn't much care about, but who carry information the way all people carry information in networks that spread. Not because it revealed who he was. I already knew who he was because it freed me. For 4 years, I had been navigating the Voss family with the careful, measured patience of a man who is protecting someone he loves from the full weight of who her family is. I had been making choices that were about preservation, of Eloise's peace, of her relationships, of the fragile fiction that things could improve if I was just a little more patient, a little more careful, a little more strategic about when to speak and when to keep my mouth shut. The wine freed me from that, not to be angry. Anger is not a strategy, but to be clear, to be honest with myself about what was true, and to handle what was true the way I handle everything, professionally, methodically, and with full knowledge of what the facts actually are. Harlan Voss spent 15 years building a reputation on leverage. He leveraged relationships, leveraged his name, leveraged the social architecture of Highland Park into something he could use. What he never figured out is that leverage only works when the other person doesn't know what they're holding. I knew what I was holding. I just hadn't decided to use it yet. It's been 8 months since New Year's Eve. Eloise and I had dinner last weekend at a restaurant in Bishop Arts that we've been going to since before we got married. She ordered the halibut. I ordered the steak. We talked for 3 hours about everything except her family, which is its own kind of progress, because a year ago, that silence would have been full of things we weren't saying. Now it's just Tuesday. She's in therapy. She'll tell you that herself. She's not someone who hides from what she needs to do. She's been doing the hard work of figuring out what she wants her relationship with her parents to look like going forward, which is not something I can do for her and not something I would try to do. That's hers. Garrett, her brother, called me last month. He said he wanted to apologize for not saying anything at the dinner table. I told him I appreciated that and I meant it. He said, "I always knew you were the one person in that room who actually knew what you were doing." I said, "I'm not sure that's a compliment to either of us." He laughed, which felt like something. My practice is doing well. It is always doing well because the work is real and the clients are real and the problems I solve are real. And none of that depends on whose house I sit in at New Year's Eve. My mother, who passed away 3 years ago in a small house in Fort Worth, where she'd lived for 30 years, used to say, "Conrad, people will tell you who they are. Your job is to believe them the first time." She told me that when I was maybe 12 years old, and I'm still 34 years later trying to live up to it. I believed Harlan Voss. I just waited too long to act on what I believed. If you're watching this, and you're in a situation where someone, a family member, a boss, anyone with social power over something you care about, has decided that you are less than what you are, I want to say something to you directly. The humiliation they hand you is not information about your value. It is information about their fear. Harlan Voss threw wine at my face because I was the one person in that room he couldn't control. Every cutting comment, every dismissal, every small performance of superiority. It was all, every bit of it. A man trying to manage his terror of someone who didn't need him. You don't have to be an attorney to act with precision and patience. You don't have to have a Preston where to call when things go sideways. What you have to have is clarity about what's actually true and the willingness to act on it without letting other people's definitions of you get in the way. The dinner table in Highland Park that night was designed to tell me who I was. I already knew who I was. You know what hit me hardest about Conrad's story? It wasn't the wine. It was the silence. The moment when everyone at that table made a choice, and most of them chose wrong. I think about that a lot. How the people who never throw anything are sometimes just as responsible as the ones who do. Conrad didn't lose his temper. He didn't beg for respect. He just got very clear, and that clarity changed everything. So my question for you is there someone in your life you've been giving patience to when what they actually need is consequences? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this mean something to you, subscribe because we're just getting started.